This is Green Street, the Environmental Health Show, greenstreetnews.org, Patti and Doug Wood, and our worldwide network of experts here every week to keep you up to date on what's happening in the world of environmental health and what you need to know to keep yourself and your family safe and healthy, because the government clearly isn't going to do it for you. Welcome back. It's a recurring theme in modern society. A new product or service is developed, and before science has a chance to fully investigate all of the pros and cons, marketing plans are created and implemented, and the product or service starts making money, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars. Then eventually science comes along and it becomes evident that the new product or service has serious, sometimes even fatal flaws. That certainly seems to be the case with artificial turf fields, as more and more evidence accumulates that these giant pieces of plastic are serious threats to both human health and the environment. We'll talk with two reporters who've done some investigative work on artificial turf, and what they found should concern everyone. That's all coming up on this edition of Green Street, but first, some of the headlines of the week from the environmental health world. Patti, what have you got for us this week?
Quincy, Massachusetts. They have recently purchased new firefighting turnout gear that was promoted as being free from PFAS forever chemicals. But independent testing of the new equipment revealed high levels of PFAS.
This is in equipment that's supposed to be PFAS-free.
Correct. That's why they bought it.
Yeah.
Right. So Quincy Mayor Thomas Koch said, quote, "It's truly outrageous to me and deeply troubling that we stand here today talking about how the new gear that we bought, sold to us on the premise that it had no PFAS in it, was recently independently tested and came back highly positive with PFAS compounds."
How do they get away with that? I mean, no PFAS means no PFAS,
yeah,
right?
But what's really good about this article is that they actually tested it after they purchased it.
Yeah.
Somebody just said, you know what?
I'm
let's
suspicious.
just make sure.
Good.
Make sure. So over the last few years, a growing body of scientific evidence has detailed the dangers of PFAS. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is called IARC, it's an arm of the World Health Organization, classified certain PFAS chemicals as carcinogenic and affirmed their risk to humans. Quincy, Massachusetts, began purchasing new gear 2 years ago. At the request of the International Association of Firefighters local union, the city recently sent a set of its newly purchased gear for independent analysis to confirm the manufacturer's PFAS-free claims, and the test came back positive. So anybody listening, if you know of somebody who's, volunteer firefighter or somebody working in a fire department and they're going to move to PFAS-free gear, have it independently tested before you start using it.
This reminds me of the artificial turf people who are claiming that their fields are PFAS-free, and when you look closely, what it means is they're below a certain threshold. So the companies...
And the threshold is in parts per million.
The companies themselves have picked the threshold level below which they are claiming that the level is PFAS-free.
How are they allowed to actually say that these fields are PFAS-free when they've actually determined some arbitrary level that they can now say they're PFAS-free?
Well, and I'm wondering if the same isn't true for this turnout gear. As long as we're below, X parts per million, which we know is not protective,
It's
right?
not protective. It's not sufficient. You need to test at the least parts per trillion.
Right.
And as we've said before, former head of NIEHS, National Institutes for Environmental Health Sciences, says this particular class of chemicals should be tested in parts per quadrillion because it can have harmful effects on humans at that infinitesimal amount.
All right, what else you got?
Just a quick one, but an interesting one, another one to keep your eyes out for, what's in your child's school, especially in their gymnasium. Mercury was found in the flooring of a Long Island school. 2 schools in the Long Island town of Glen Cove are replacing gymnasium floors following the startling discovery of mercury vapors emanating from old rubberized flooring. Engineers upgrading the middle school gym this summer noticed the presence of mercury in polyurethane flooring installed decades ago. At room temperature or when heated, mercury can release toxic vapors. The high school measured more than 3 times the allowable limit. Dr. Jacqueline Moline, an expert in occupational medicine at North Shore University Hospital, said, quote, over time, the body will get rid of the mercury. The type of mercury that is in gymnasiums is going to be mercury vapor. So the health effects related to this are predominantly neurological. The district says with ventilation and new floors, students will not be at risk. However, at least one Glen Cove athlete is giving up indoor sports after his doctor measured higher than average mercury in his blood.
So Glen Cove schools can't be the only schools that have this problem,
100%. Yeah,
right?
the schools are all using the same polyurethane flooring.
And who's doing the testing of the air in these gyms?
I don't know. And why did they do it in Glen Cove?
I don't know. That's interesting.
Good thing they did.
Again.
And maybe, once again, that will alert other parents, administrators, and so on of schools to check the mercury level in the air in gymnasiums.
Yeah. Wow. A lot of kids are being exposed who don't know it. All right. You got anything? Is there any good news?
All exposures.
Oh, boy.
But it looks like men may be responsible for about half of all infertility cases. We always like to point the finger at the woman, but
of course,
let's
always the woman's
go.
fault.
Let's go.
Okay.
Studies show that problems with male fertility contribute to approximately half of all cases of infertility, but it is much less discussed than female infertility, partly due to the social and cultural taboos surrounding it. What?
Can't be the man.
Now, new research suggests the whole spectrum of reproductive problems in men is increasing, including declining sperm counts, decreasing testosterone levels, and increasing rates of erectile dysfunction and testicular cancer. Rebecca Blanchard at the University of Nottingham in England is investigating the effect of environmental chemicals found within the home. She is using dogs as a sentinel model, a kind of early warning alarm system for humans. The dog shares our environment, she says. It lives in the same household and is exposed to the same chemical contaminants as us. If we look at the dog, we can see what's going on in the human.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep. Her research has focused on chemicals found in plastics, fire retardants, and common household items. Some of these chemicals have been banned, but they still linger in the environment, such as those ubiquitous forever PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
Her studies have revealed that these chemicals can disrupt hormonal systems, harming the fertility of both dogs and men. What she found was a reduction in sperm motility in both the human and the dog. And there was also an increase in the amount of DNA fragmentation, damage or breaks in the genetic material of the sperm. That's concerning. The findings align with other research showing the damage to fertility caused by chemicals found in plastics, household medications, in the food chain, and in the air. It affects men as well as women and even babies. Climate change may also negatively impact male fertility, with several animal studies suggesting that sperm are especially vulnerable to the effects of increasing temperatures. Heat waves have been shown to damage sperm in insects, and a similar impact has been observed in humans. A 2022 study found that high ambient temperature due to global warming or working in a hot environment negatively affects sperm quality.
Wow. Well, I know we had Shanna Swan on the show a while ago after she wrote her book Countdown, talking about the decline in sperm, 50% decline
in sperm
over
counts,
50 years or something like that. I mean, it's a dramatic decrease. All right. Well, that's a lot to think about, and
it sure is
a lot to be concerned about.
Yep.
And it just goes to show you can't trust what manufacturers say about their products.
Well, that's really, really problematic, especially that article here about the PFAS in the firefighting equipment.
I know. I mean,
that's really problematic, and just good for them in Quincy, Massachusetts. And I don't know who the individual was who said, you know what, we're going to make sure we're going to go out and get this independently tested before we start using this stuff. And sure enough, it showed high levels, not just a little bit, but high levels of PFAS in the new no PFAS gear that they had just purchased.
All right. Thanks, Patty.
You're welcome.
Over the past 20 years, a familiar pattern has played out in communities across the country. It goes something like this. A salesman shows up in town hawking an amazing new kind of athletic field that never needs to be mowed, never needs pesticides, and can be played on in any weather condition. This state-of-the-art field lasts for years and can even be imprinted with the town or school's logo. Even professional sports teams are playing on this new miracle surface. The salesman makes friends with the local sports coaches and talks to parents about how great the new field would be for their young athletes. And before too long, the community decides to spend millions of dollars ripping up the old grass field and replacing it with a shiny new plastic synthetic turf field. In the United States alone, there are approximately 13,000 synthetic turf sports fields, with about 1,500 new ones being installed each year. But a dark cloud has begun to form over these fields. As with most things that seem too good to be true, synthetic turf fields are turning out to be just that.
Each year, each month actually, it seems like more health problems are linked to PFAS. And there's a question, and people are saying, look, we need to study this more, especially when it comes to turf and PFAS in the turf.
That's Barbara Laker, a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, talking about PFAS chemicals, those forever chemicals that are now being recognized as cancer-causing, endocrine-disrupting substances that are among the most toxic and most persistent and most widely used of any chemicals in our world. Barbara and fellow reporter David Gambacorta have been writing about the chemicals in synthetic turf ever since they first learned about 6 members of the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team who all died of glioblastoma, an aggressive brain cancer.
In 2022, David West, a former pitcher for the Philadelphia Phillies that died of glioblastoma, and he at that time became the 6th former member of the Phillies who died of brain cancer. And that piqued Barbara's interest in mine, and we wondered if there could potentially be a connection between these illnesses because glioblastoma is, such a rare form of cancer. And our attention turned to where the Phillies had played from 1971 to 2003, and that was Veterans Stadium. The stadium was demolished in 2004, so we couldn't quite dig it up. But Barbara had started consulting with some scientific experts, and they suggested that we consider looking at the turf. And fortunately, we were able to find actual pieces of the Vets turf on eBay because the Phillies had in 1982 given away pieces of their turf, the turf that had actually been on the field when they won the World Series in 1980. And luckily for us, people had kept these little squares of turf in its original plastic, fully sealed for the better part of 4 decades, and we were able to get those samples tested by 2 different labs.
So the first lab we took them to, an expert told me to go to Eurofins lab in Lancaster. She told me to ask for them to test it for 70 different PFAS, because as you guys probably know, there's like thousands upon thousands, like 12,000 different kinds of PFAS, and only 2 really have been studied extensively. And so, or not even really extensively, but studied at all. So we asked for the testing of 70 different PFAS. And at that lab, it came back with 16 different PFAS, including one of the ones that they've studied as being a health hazard. And then I had been talking to Graham Peasley, an expert at Notre Dame University. And he actually offered to, if we got more samples, so David got more samples of the turf, and we mailed those samples to Graham Peasley at Notre Dame, and he tested it too. Not for as many, not as for 70, but he also found several PFAS in the samples that we gave him. And this was, what's amazing is this turf was 40 years old and older. So if PFAS is still there, 40 years later, it kind of proves that there's a reason why they're called forever chemicals.
Of course, mere exposure to these toxic chemicals doesn't prove they are the cause of the Phillies' cancer. There were some experts who took exception to the idea that PFAS in the turf could be responsible.
We had been in conversation for months with the Phillies leading up to the publication of the first story, which we had called Field of Dread. We tried to be really transparent with our reporting, and the fact that we had not solved this in so many words. It wasn't like we had sort of an airtight conclusion that we came to. It was more we'd found these chemicals, and that certainly seemed to suggest a possible link. And right before we published the story, that the Phillies sent us statements, some of which were from a professor at Duke, and he, was adamant that there was no way that PFAS could have caused glioblastoma, that it couldn't cross the blood-brain barrier, and sort of seemingly saying that this, even to pose this as a possible theory, was wrong. And Barbara reached out to more experts and did quite a bit of 11th hour digging.
Barbara's digging paid off. Sure enough, there were solid studies in the literature refuting the claim that the chemicals couldn't possibly be responsible for the brain cancer.
These studies showed that not only PFAS can be found in the brain, so that throughout the whole theory that it can't cross the brain barrier, but also one study that looked at tumors, glioblastoma tumors, that PFAS was actually found in the tumors. Since we published that story, there have been more studies that raise the possibility that glioblastoma can be linked to toxins, including PFAS. We're not saying that it caused it. We're not saying anything like that. We're saying that PFAS clearly causes a number of health issues. It's been linked to prostate cancer, kidney cancer, like 2 or 3 cancers. And people are saying, look, we need to study this more, especially when it comes to turf and PFAS in the turf. The temperatures get really, really hot on the turf. David and I went to archives at both Temple University and City Archives, and it showed that during the time the Phillies players played at the vet, that the temperature of the turf could get up to like 160 degrees. And experts told us that when you have a chemical like that and you heat it up, it becomes more toxic. It vaporizes and becomes more toxic. So theoretically, that these players and anyone playing on turf can inhale it. They know it can be absorbed through the skin. And everyone is crying out saying, look, we need more studies on this to know exactly is there a link? And if so, how strong is it? And what action should be taken as a result?
So why is it that no one knew about these toxic chemicals before now? Why didn't anyone raise the red flags back when these fields first came on the market?
Because the chemical companies knew that PFAS was being used, obviously, in the turf for decades. But all the experts that David and I talked to told us that outside the chemical companies or the turf companies, nobody else was aware that PFAS was actually in the turf until 2019. So like years and years went by where we weren't even aware. We didn't know that PFAS was in it. And in fact, when David and I started working on this series and I first learned of the term PFAS, I thought I'd never heard of PFAS. And I'm like, what? How do you say that? What is it? And then, of course, we learned a lot more about it. And it was kind of amazing to me that the chemical companies knew about this and knew the dangers of PFAS for a long, long time and didn't tell anyone that it's not listed as an ingredient because it's used in the manufacturing part. And it's not like you buy a Teflon pan and it says one of the ingredients is PFAS. So I think that's one reason why the studies haven't been all completed yet, because we didn't even know PFAS was in all these things for years and years.
For many years, children's health advocates and pediatricians have worried about the impact of exposure to the toxins in the crumb rubber that's used to cushion synthetic turf fields. Crumb rubber is known to contain a long list of harmful chemicals that volatilize into the air and athletes breathe in every time they play on the field.
We know the crumb rubber has lead and all these other chemicals that they know are carcinogenic. So everyone who plays on it is kind of getting hit from both sides, because the crumb rubber contains carcinogens and PFAS could be carcinogenic. So you're getting it every which way. And so I think that's another reason why it's hard to determine, like, if there is a higher rate of people who play on turf and get cancer, what's causing it? Is it the crumb rubber? Is it the PFAS? Is it both? How do you determine that?
Professional sports is big business, and professional sports teams spend a lot of money on players they have a vested interest in protecting, not only to keep them healthy during their playing careers, but to avoid costly litigation years later after they retire. How are the pros reacting to this news about the toxins in synthetic turf?
One thing that came up in the fall of 2023 was the NFL Players Union. They have for years been collecting data on player injury rates on artificial turf versus natural grass, and have really tried to campaign on that aspect of players getting hurt more when they're playing on turf. But for the first time now, they are expressing concern about PFAS exposure and the potential that may be leading to illnesses among football players. And I think, we did kind of limit ourselves with that first story on glioblastoma. I think if we sort of broaden the lens to a lot of other cancers, and there's, some official effort made to survey other teams and other organizations, I feel pretty certain that we'd be talking about more than a handful of cases. And I think that's really what's been missing to this point is, on an official level, whether it's Major League Baseball or the NFL, someone wanting to really dig in to this issue and determine whether there's a there. And just in talking with former NFL players in the fall, their sense was that this was not something that the NFL would really want to be digging into. One ex-Eagle that I had talked to said, the league is still contending with a lot of fallout from the concussion litigation and all of the concerns about the health impact of those injuries. Why would they want to open another can of worms and have another health issue to be talking about? I think as time goes on, there will be more organizations wanting to look into this. Maybe we're a little bit of canary in the coal mine in a sense. The thing that I was struck by, the NFL, I think, their revenue is somewhere around $12 billion a year. The stadiums have evolved so much in the last 30 years from, cookie cutter municipal stadiums that really were not always of the best quality to now stadiums themselves cost $1 billion to construct. So seemingly there would be a way to find the money to have natural grass in all of the stadiums if there was a will to do that.
The issues surrounding PFAS and playing fields don't stop when the field reaches the end of its life, usually about 7 to 8 years. How do you dispose of tons and tons of plastic carpeting imbued with toxic chemicals and filled with old ground-up vehicle tires with their own toxic chemicals? The same factors that make these fields dangerous for anyone to spend time on make them incredibly hard to dispose of. David Gambacorta and Barbara Laker looked into this issue too, and what they found was quite disturbing.
We found that there's this so-called recycling company out of Denmark, and they had people telling all these municipalities that yeah, you just give us the turf and we'll have it recycled at the first facility in the U.S. in Pennsylvania. And it turns out the facility isn't open, and the company in some instances was taking the turf and then dumping it in like farmlands across Pennsylvania, acres and acres of toxic waste just sitting there. And they don't have a recycling plant. Then we found another guy who said he recycles it. And I went to his plant and he had this whirring machine going on. And he told me later that he was separating the crumb rubber and the sand in that machine and reselling it. And then I said, well, what do you do with the grass part, like the blade part? Yeah, and he said, well, we have partners who we are giving that to. And I said, well, who are your partners? And he said, that's none of your business. So who knows? And then we started digging deeper, and we found, like, on Facebook and all these other websites, there are all these people selling turf all over Pennsylvania, all over the country, but like especially in the Northeast. And they're lining like batting cages, dog runs, all this stuff with it. I suspect some of it is just in some river or creek, wherever, where they could just dump it. Because it costs, as you know, like with tires, you can't put it in a landfill. You can put artificial turf in a landfill in Pennsylvania, but it would cost a lot of money. And so I suspect that some of it's just dumped somewhere.
So now what? What do we do with 13,000 toxic synthetic turf fields? What are parents and coaches supposed to do? What are school boards and communities supposed to do?
This is not an issue that really had been extensively studied. Nobody was attempting in the 80s and 90s to determine whether or not there were some risks at play that were worth monitoring over the years ahead. So, right now what's emerging is more anecdotal. But I think we're going to be learning a lot, in the next couple of years as studies sort of intensify and it's more attention is being drawn to this issue.
Barbara Laker and David Gambacorta, investigative reporters for the Philadelphia Inquirer, in an interview we conducted a few years ago, talking about what they learned and what every parent of a young athlete should know about artificial turf fields. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Green Street. Special thanks to our guests, Barbara Laker and David Gambacorta, and all of you who listen to and support this show. Patty and I will be back next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.